Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ron Ansana. Almost any way we look at it, the global economy is in the middle of a major transformation, one that will have deep and lasting implications for how nations and their citizens interact, work, invest, and think about their place in the world. The U.S. and other Western economies have grown increasingly inward-looking while struggling to contain skyrocketing levels of public debt. Now, many emerging markets are much more open and prosperous than just a decade ago, but they haven't shown much inclination to lead on the political stage. This shift in the global balance comes at a time of political unrest and regime change in the Middle East, an escalating debt crisis in Europe, heightened financial market volatility, and growing fears about a worldwide slowdown in growth. Predicting what happens next is never an easy task, but we can take practical steps today to prepare for the potential challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Joining me now to discuss these changes and how we can plan for them are Lisa Shallot, Chief Investment Officer for Merrill Lynch Global Wealth Management, and Ian Bremer, President of the Eurasia Group, a leading consultancy on geopolitical risk. They're the co-authors of a just-released report on the topics we'll be discussing today called New World, New Rules. And Lisa, Ian, I welcome you both. And let me ask you, Ian, we've heard the phrase, New World Order, New Paradigm many times over the last couple of decades. Maybe it was accurate or inaccurate then, but why is the New World and the new set of rules appropriate today?
Well, we thought we'd done New World Order a few times, but in reality we hadn't. When the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991, folks were writing about the end of history, New World Order, New World Disorder, but the reality was globalization driven by the West, with Western institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. That's still how the world was ordered. 9/11 occurred, big shock to the global economy 10 years later, but the world order wasn't changed. And again, Western-dominated institutions were still absolutely the way we thought about globalization and the global economy. But while all of that was happening, you had massive underlying power changes between emerging markets and developed states, the U.S. and China, and debtor economies and creditor economies. And with the 2008 financial crisis, finally, you actually did have an undoing of that global order. And that's what we're now living through. It's not just about Europe. It's not just about the U.S. and the problems of the deficit. It's not just about the Arab Spring and the Arab Winter. It's actually about this global shift that's occurring in the absence of effective governance. And that is a period of creative destruction in the geopolitical and geoeconomic space that we've not seen since World War II.
So, Lisa, in practical terms, what does this great global shift mean, as Ian's describing it, in kind of a broader context?
Yeah, for the last 40 years, we've had a global economic order where global GDP was driven by the West, and most specifically the United States, and perhaps even more specifically, the U.S. consumer. And this is why 2008 is so important as a noteworthy inflection point, because I believe history will show that 2008 and the financial crisis that's grounded in the housing crisis will mark the turning point in the dominant role that the U.S. consumer plays in the global economy. We have a global economy today where 2/3 of the growth is coming from the developing world, not from the U.S. and not from Europe. Look at 2012 forecasts. Everyone is quite concerned about a U.S. recession, about the potential for a European recession. Even looking at the forecasts with those two big regions coming down to sub 2% growth, we're looking at a globe that is still probably going to grow at 4% because emerging markets are going to grow at 4 to 6.
And Warren Buffett famously said during the crisis that when the tide goes out, at least among investors, you find out who's swimming naked. But when the tide went out in 2008, with respect to the new world, did we find out, or were new things revealed as a consequence of the crisis? The weak underpinnings maybe of the West and the strengthening underpinnings of the East, for lack of a better description.
Yeah, it turned out the Chinese had a full wetsuit. Who knew, right? I mean, if it had not been for China, and if it had not been for the emerging markets, the world would be in a vastly different, a vastly worse place today than they actually are. And that's great, except that emerging markets are not fundamentally stable places, not economically, not politically. We're now in an environment where our global economic future is reliant on them. And we wonder why there's a paucity of global leadership in the world today. Well, they're not ready to do that. They're not at that level of development. Their institutions haven't reached that level of maturity. There are lots of countries with lots of domestic interests, and they're focusing on them. In the United States, they're doing the same thing.
Now, Lisa, with respect to that, I mean, there's then a degree of heightened uncertainty in the developed nations as well, much more than you would expect, given that they are, in fact, developed and have put systems in place that presumably were designed to solve principally economic problems, but political ones as well. So with that uncertainty as part of the equation, what does it mean to the global economic environment?
Well, I think it's really impacting confidence levels and willingness to invest. Because there's such a high degree of lack of visibility, inability to forecast what the outcomes are going to be, it's very hard to value potential investments, it's very hard to value existing investments, and it's very hard to make a long-term commitment to a future that looks very cloudy. And that's one of the big overhangs in capital markets today for both businesses and consumers.
And in other venues, Lisa, you've made the case that this confidence issue is the result also of a changing composition of the U.S. economy, that there's a structural unemployment issue that we have here that may not be evident in other parts of the world. Can you elaborate a little bit about that as how it affects the new world and the new set of rules?
What the data would suggest is we're in this period where, frankly, the standards of living in the West are at risk. Since 2008, while we've seen some economic recovery, real disposable personal incomes in the United States have not recovered on a sequential basis. It's the first time in 50 years that we've had an economic recovery without any income recovery for the average person in the country. One of the challenges that exists for the United States and for the Europeans are actually now that recognizing this inflection point, beginning to attack the very hard underpinnings of some of these things that are structural, that say, hey, the mix of your economy has fundamentally changed. What do you do about that? How do you create jobs and sustain a middle class if manufacturing isn't creating jobs at the historic rate that it has?
There are many who are saying that the West is done, this is the Asian century, and that we're effectively out of the game. Is that what you're saying here?
Well, no, and I'm not saying that for two reasons. One, the problem in the West is not suddenly an ability of the West to make money. You look at technology companies out there, they're doing a fantastic job, and most of the new innovations are done right in the US of A. That will continue to be the case going forward. The problem in the United States, as Lisa just said, is that there are increasingly large subset of American society that's just left out of that game. And they're not coming into it. And they're not going to come into it. And the jobs that they used to have, those manufacturing jobs, are saying, well, let's retrain them. They don't need to be retrained. They need to be trained to do something completely different. So that's the Western side. The Chinese side, do we think China's sustainable over the long term? And the answer is a very big question mark. You look at the banks today and the IMF and others, and they're all trying to figure out when China becomes the world's largest economy. 2016, 2020, 2025, 2030, depends on who you talk to, but you get a different number, right? That's actually, that presumes that China will be able to rebalance their economy and their political system with over 1 billion people, never been done before. They might be able to do it, they might not. The jury's out. So what we know is that the world's largest economy, the United States, has lots of reasons to be the world's largest economy. The world's now second largest economy, China, is going to have to change fundamentally to actually continue to grow and maintain political stability.
So Lisa, when you look at some of these kind of, dislocations or discrepancies in the outlook for China, how does that fit into the thesis that, emerging markets are to a certain extent right now the place to be and change the way people behave in an investing sense?
I think one of the things that we've identified from an investment perspective is how many people are just fundamentally underexposed to the whole paradigm shift. So it's not so much that we're saying, put all your money in emerging markets and put nothing in, your home country or the United States. Quite the contrary. But what we would say is, let's go back to that view of the economic growth. 2/3 of the growth is coming from those emerging markets. Studies we've done suggest that the average client portfolio has 3% of their wealth exposed to emerging markets. So what we're saying is there's really a need for a more global perspective. Investors need to begin to open up that mindset, to embrace that global mindset, to say, you know, I need to seek investment opportunities where there's growth, where there's income, where there's balance sheet stability, and some of those things are outside the United States.
Right.
Not all those things,
Yeah.
but some of them.
If I may be so bold as to challenge that assumption for the moment, you could look at emerging market growth, and it has clearly outperformed developed country economies. But you can look at emerging markets, and they've actually underperformed, let's say, the S&P 500.
Yeah.
So how do you intelligently approach what you're saying, which is to find those opportunities in the emerging markets that match up with growth, as opposed to, let's say, the Shanghai Composite, which has dramatically underperformed the S&P for the last 18 months?
That's a great observation, Ron, and this year is a very good example of how emerging markets still do exhibit that higher degree of risk and that higher degree of volatility. The question is, how do investors navigate in an environment where there's just this higher level of volatility, which we think post-2008 we're going to be in for a while. And so one of the things that we've said is that really requires a more flexible approach and a more dynamic approach. Dynamic from the perspective of you've got to rebalance more often. When the volatility is running 3 times what it was, you can't just buy and hold. You have opportunities to routinely exploit the market dislocations that are happening more frequently to rebalance. In addition, you need to be flexible. It may not simply be cash, equity, fixed income anymore. We may need to think about cash, equity, fixed income, commodity, currencies, real estate, and other alternatives. So it's a more complex world, and we need to be a little bit more open-minded in how we think about potentially navigating and preserving our wealth against higher volatility.
Ian, is there any simplicity, though, that you can identify in this complexity? I mean, it does seem chaotic in a certain sense when we look at the world, but it's almost as if from 1982, for instance, to 2000, we had the Great Moderation, and everyone assumed that peace and prosperity became a permanent feature of the human landscape, as you said, the end of history. Now we have an environment that in some ways is more normal with respect to the way world history is operated. We just don't know how to operate within that normal.
Well, I think one way to simplify is to understand that over the last 30 years, we've been focused on growth. In a higher risk environment, we need to focus also on resilience. Shocks are going to come, many more shocks. They'll come, they'll be internally driven, and they'll come from all over the world. In those environments, you can't focus as much on growth. Japan has nothing to teach us about growth. For the last 2 decades, there's nothing we could learn from Japan about growth. We can learn a lot from the Japanese about resilience. The Fukushima incident that they had with the nuclear catastrophe, and 6 months later, they had almost 100% of their supply chain from the Northeast province running perfectly well. This great global shift is not a matter of just 1 year. It's been since 2000. It's been building up for 40 years. The growth of China and the change in balance started in '78 when Deng Xiaoping started opening up his system. 33 years and going of 10% plus state-directed growth. The rise of the BRICS has been coming for decades now. The shift between debtor and creditor nations has been coming for decades now. And then only sudden was it blown apart in 2008. And we're now really realizing that in 2011, 2009, when people said the recession was over, we can start spending money again. So if it's taken that long to work its way through to our consciousness, we shouldn't pretend it's going to be away in 6 months or 12 months.
You know, that then challenges the traditional orthodoxies that we have in the investing world. So how does that affect the outcomes of what's happening here, both from, you know, an economic perspective, broadly speaking, and then from an investing perspective as well?
Yeah, well, it gets back to this whole idea of the consumer economy. We have an economy that for the last really 25 years has been fundamentally driven by the U.S. consumer. That may be shifting, and we may now be in a period where excess income gains are actually put towards savings, and the way people approach wealth is not about wealth accumulation anymore. It's actually about wealth preservation, and it's not so much about let me, get the stock that's going to generate lots of capital gains, but rather let me invest my money to generate income that I can see and that is reliable.
Practically speaking, what does that mean?
What that may mean is that the days of buy and hold as we used to define it may be evolving. And that buy and hold may mean, yes, I'm anchored to a long-run asset allocation plan, which we endorse, but I'm going to revisit it more frequently. I'm going to link it to very specific goals, to very specific timelines for those goals. And I'm going to seek a much higher degree of visibility and certainty around my ability to achieve it because I've now experienced this trauma.
And so that forces people to redefine risk as it has been traditionally defined as minimizing loss. Risk now is taking on an entirely new dimension.
Oh, exactly. And I think what we're getting at is that risk management, how we think about risk management, is evolving. At one time we said, okay, risk management is just about diversify, right? We just need to get different sources of growth, and that's very important. But now we also need to think about correlations. And so what we need to do is we need to think about not just diversifying, but diversifying to things that are not correlated. So you think about what's happened with gold in this past year. One of the reasons that gold has kind of emerged, it's not because it's necessarily a great asset class, and we can talk, about
yeah,
that.
It's not my favorite, to be honest. Yeah.
But it played a role and may continue to play an important role in people's portfolios simply because it is negatively correlated with so many other asset classes that had become tightly correlated. So it's that kind of thinking that I think we need to bring to the traditional buy and hold, set it and forget it. I don't think we're living in a decade of set it and forget it.
And you're also looking at new types of opportunity. I mean, for example, Canada does a wonderful job of hedging because they're tied to the U.S. economy, but they're also able to take advantage of Asian growth. You look at, for example, the ability to build out infrastructure to deliver Canadian energy across the Pacific. British Columbia, as of May, started selling more timber to China than the United States for the first time. Mexico is completely stuck to the United States. Whether it's trade, Mexican remittances from those living abroad, whether it's tourism. If you're investing in Mexico, you're investing in the U.S. You're not hedging anything. So you have to think of risk very, very differently in this environment. You got to break up your historic thought about what emerging markets are and let's say, okay, it's not really a unified class at all.
So Lisa, what does that mean for what you've effectively described in the paperwork as the new rules of global investing?
So the new rules of global investing, as we've said, really revolve around truly embracing kind of a global perspective and having that global perspective be as inclusive as you can tolerate as an investor. The second, being flexible, looking beyond the traditional asset classes of equities, cash, and bonds, and being willing to consider opportunities that may be out there. And finally, being dynamic, being willing to accept that volatility may persist and that volatility doesn't have to be your enemy. It can actually unearth opportunities and allow you to upgrade during these periods of dislocation, upgrade the quality of your portfolio, the growth of your portfolio, the yield of your portfolio, the valuation attributes of your portfolio. Areas that we've encouraged people to look are places like Canada, places like Australia, potentially even places like in Indonesia and Malaysia, believe it or not, because these are countries whose fiscal house right now is quite in order. And those are the types of things that you're looking for, again, within the context of a highly diversified fixed income exposure.
Now, you also mentioned commodities. They've had an interesting run, and yet most commodities have retraced their gains of 2011.
Yeah.
So how do you fairly assess the role of commodities in a portfolio, particularly since their price increases and their performance have been so leveraged to that emerging market world?
The way we've thought about commodities is where is there scarcity in the world? Where do I have real fundamental demand, supply, underpinnings for a growth story. It really is in commodities, whether it's agricultural commodities, energy-based commodities, metals-based commodities. And so that's the big story. Within the big story, we're going to have lots of cyclical, perturbations. But ultimately, because they are investable, because they have certain attributes in a portfolio context in terms of their correlations with certain other assets, because of their the secular growth story, they have a place. And that place is to be alongside some of those other alternative investments.
To a certain extent, if you're an American, this sounds like a somewhat pessimistic forecast in the sense that, Ian, we're saying, all right, look away from the United States. Is that what you're saying, or is there reason to be optimistic that the U.S. ultimately does come out of this period of transition or this period of stress stronger and or better?
You can't be purely optimistic about the United States where unemployment is and where consumption is going, right? Those are realities. But the United States is the biggest and safest game out there still. You see that in the dollar, and you see that in treasuries. And that is also not going to change.
It's worth pointing out, U.S. markets have actually outperformed this year throughout all of this kind of dislocation. And there's a lot of reasons for people to maintain a big portion of their portfolio in the United States. You have some of the greatest companies with the healthiest balance sheets, with market share leading positions. They are global winners, and they will probably continue to be. I think you're going to see all that investment potential, all that cash sitting on the sidelines with individual investors, all that cash sitting on corporate balance sheets begin to be put to work. So yeah, it's tough right now. It's causing us to ask a lot of fundamental questions, but that's a healthy thing. And I'm quite hopeful.
Last question. What does an awakened America look like in a new world, with new rules?
I suppose an awakened America is one that is much more aware that they cannot impose their will on other parts of the world as easily. They shouldn't try as hard. And yet, American leadership is perhaps just as necessary, maybe even more so, as it was in the course of the last 50 plus years. It's not as if there's anyone else out there that is capable or willing to play that leadership role. We saw that in Libya. We've seen that on Israel-Palestine. We'll see it in a bunch of other places as well. And it's the United States resisting the desire to turn inwards, resisting the isolationism, because if the U.S. turns in that direction, no one will be hurt more than the multinational corporations based in the U.S. that have benefited so greatly from having access to the world's markets. That's what it looks like.
All right, Lisa Shallop, Ian Bremmer, thank you very much.